Peace, strain. Peace, strain. This is the theme assigned to us this week by our worship and music ministry. And quite frankly, I was hoping for a theme or biblical text this week that would reflect something other than tension. Something other than a strain or a force pulling us away, sometimes into extreme or damaging degree. Something other than creating an excessive demand or tightness on someone or something or me. But this is precisely where we find ourselves today, both in the gospel reading and Paul's letter to the Romans and in the countercultural narrative in Zechariah. It is precisely where we are invited into the story where we find a God who holds us captive in the promise and covenant of hope, even in the midst, or perhaps especially in the midst, of cultural, political, and personal reality. A reality that weighs us down when we are feeling the weight of tension in the home, perhaps our marriage, our workplace, tension in the political landscape, tension between nations at war, tension in lands whose people live under occupation and fear, tension among religious leaders and churches, or simply, well, maybe not so simply, feeling the weight of day-to-day struggles when things are just not right. Or we are just not right, torn apart by decisions we have made or not made, or actions that have disrupted our relationship between others and God. But that is the intensity with which we find Jesus today. Come to think of it, that's where I see Jesus most of the time. So it shouldn't surprise me and perhaps you that living in the strain and the tension may just be the name of the game when we are following Jesus. When we are doing our very best to live as people of God, but still feel the burdens of life and injustice dragging us down. You know, the story in our gospel reading today was written when the Jesus movement was still pretty fragile. And I have to wonder if some of that fragility still lingers today. Jesus said, "What will I compare this generation to? It's like they're like children sitting in the marketplaces and calling to one another. Well, we played the flute for you, and you didn't dance. We wailed, and you didn't mourn. For John came neither eating nor drinking, as they say, because he probably has a demon. And the Son of Man, Jesus, came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." I sense a little tension in the air, don't you? The audience Jesus is addressing today are arguing. They're going back and forth and comparing the message of Jesus with John the Baptist. John, with his extreme plainness and simplicity of style, characterizing an austere way of living life with a certain soberness or strictness, whereas the religious authorities called him possessed. And on the other hand, Jesus comes offering a message of eating and drinking in a celebratory way, not flouting the law by no means, but taking a light and fresh approach to tradition, enjoying the day that God had made, living into the abundance of God's goodness and grace, And the religious leaders called him a drunkard, a glutton, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And even John questions Jesus' approach to life. Is he really the one who has come to set things right in the world? Is he really the one who is going to bring peace to the poor and the marginalized and overthrow the harsh leadership that has kept people captive and living in fear? Is he really the one who will set the religious leaders straight, those who have been complicit with the Roman rulers and the ruling elite, those who secure wealth, status, and power at the expense of the lowly? A social order that Jesus rejects as being contrary to the will of God. But Jesus offers the people a vision of wisdom, which is vindicated by the deeds of wisdom. In other words, Jesus claims that in order to set people free, to liberate people, this is how you love people and why you love people. Wisdom is often associated with the works of God, and Matthew is associating the works of Jesus with the wisdom and love of God. The works of Jesus, you see, in Matthew's gospel are gender equality, open table fellowship, nonviolent resistance to Rome, a critique of hierarchy demonstrated by God's true wisdom in action in the world is the wisdom of Jesus. And this is what Jesus' arrival on the scene meant. It gave way to those that had no access to this way of life. And this was so counter to the religious authorities and the empire that it got Jesus killed. And so real that we are still talking about it today. Strain, peace strain, not yet. You know, this exchange of doubt and dialogue is an approach of the powers that be and often used to manipulate public opinion. When someone criticizes you, you attack them personally, assault their character, drag their name through the mud, and accuse them of insufficient piety. And this is why Jesus addresses this generation as infants, children. And quite frankly, I think Jesus is not too far off when it comes to addressing us. I recall a time when one of my kids, and I always promise I won't give their name, but most of you know I have two. So, your guess. You know, they decided, one of the boys accused his brother of not playing the game of Monopoly right. You see, one of the boys kept his money like this, and all his properties were laid out evenly. And the other one was a pile. And the problem was he was the banker, the one with the mess. Well, the discussion became heated, and quite frankly, both of them were right. But they just couldn't give in or look at the bigger picture of what truly mattered. Both of them were so intent to protect what they individually thought would bring good results that it ended with me playing referee. And I'm not sure you would find my method in the best way to parent, but I put them in handcuffs. One of their uncles was the sheriff at the time in Muskegon County, and it actually had a key. So together, did they struggle. They went back and forth, but they couldn't get away from each other. And eventually, I heard laughter, because everywhere they had to go together. And so the dialogue and the time together gave them some peace and lessened the weighty argument. For the religious authorities, they just couldn't steer clear on what mattered. They could not, or they could only sit in judgment. The religious wise who seriously go about trying to protect God had missed the point. They have missed the message. I hope I don't miss the message in my heaviness and burdensome arguments sometimes. Because when you miss the point, you miss out on the hope that remains grounded in the conviction of God's grace. And when you miss the hope that brings freedom to love all people right where they are, to stand in the gap for those who simply cannot stand in the gap on their feet alone, you simply have strain, not peace strain. Living in the tension of our Christian faith can weigh us down, not only from an outward perspective or from opinions of others, but internally too. The Apostle Paul, in our reading from Romans today, it finds Paul describing the competing forces actually within himself. I do not understand my own actions, Paul says, for I do not do what I want, but the very thing I hate. Paul, do I ever feel that sometimes? Maybe you do too. The inner struggles that keep us tossing and turning at night weigh us down. Fear, anger, pride, and all the nagging insecurity that we are not working hard enough, loving long enough, repairing relationships soon enough. You know, the things that burden us. And if we are to be honest with one another, we all have them. We all have these inner struggles at one time or another, and they weigh us down. You know, I admire those in 12-step programs that seek honest answers and help, which brings peace, not only to themselves, but our living testimony of God's gracious love. If you have ever had loved ones with addictions or alcohol problems, they live the first 3 steps. But one of my loved ones at one point in time came to me in the throes of this addiction and said, I want to stop. I want to stop, but my mind and my body, my mind and my flesh won't let me. Ooh, that came to mind this week when I read Paul. But what had to happen was we, the first step says, we were powerless over whatever, that our lives had become unmanageable. And we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And we made a decision. We made a decision to turn our lives over to God. Burdens, mine, yours, and others. We all experience inner struggles. It just looks a little different for everyone. You see, the sin that entangles us is our humanity, and God gets that. God gets that. Strain, yes. Peace strain, almost. Jesus said, come to me all that are weary and are carrying burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden light. And the people who Jesus is addressing in the gospel today, those who were weary and heavily burdened, consisted of poor people in a condition of political and religious oppression. Those who were stretched to their limit at no fault of their own, but to languish in the rest that Jesus is talking about is to find more than just sleep. It was to find a rest of the Sabbath kind. The kind of rest that puts a person on the path to recovery and freedom to love. And the yoke Jesus refers to, I often envision this as a piece of wood fastened around the necks of two animals, but it also meant the Torah or the law. So he says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me. I am the law. This is the way to live. It is the law of love that Jesus is referring to. Take loving kindness, goodness, benevolence, forgiveness upon you, even in the midst of strain. Living in light of the freedom and dignity of every person is the mission of Jesus. And it is our mission, too. And it is not heavy. In fact, it can even be celebratory and joyous. But if I am truly honest with you today, it is hard. It is hard to live in the midst of tension and strain. Our burdens do get heavy. Mine, yours. However, I believe we need to embrace our struggles, both internally and from the outside. We need to embrace the pain and suffering of others. We need to come together for a meal. In fact, I don't think we have a choice if we are yoked with Jesus. Experiencing deep grace without deep struggle sounds a little tenuous. Strain, yes. But we are riding on the peace strain, especially when we are yoked with the one who is love. Amen.